virtual room together. So it's a pleasure to introduce them. I'm going to provide a little more depth to their background. We're going to begin with 3 unique presentations, first by Craig Lipset, then by Dr. Michelle Longmire, and then by Sharon Terry. And then we're going to go and be joined by Stephanie Kuhner of Bristol Myers Squibb and Dr. Emil Kalali, who is the founder and curator of CNS Summit. He is also one of the global visionaries behind Decentralized Clinical Trials. So first, just a brief introduction on each of our panelists today. It's a privilege, and I would urge all of our participants, all of our listeners, to connect with these people either by way of LinkedIn or Twitter. They're all active on social media, and they are all dedicated to the space and helping people succeed. So first, Dr. Michelle Longmire. First of all, Michelle, I want to congratulate you on just completing another capital raise, $78 million to really provide new technologies to your enterprise. You are doing exceptional work with Medable. And I just want to mention to our audience today that you're a Stanford-trained physician, a dermatologist. In your history before medical school, actually, you were known as a tough dirt bike rider. I think that's where you get your grit. You come from a storied family of research scientists going way back. I think you're the 3rd generation of people who are looking at genetics, as a matter of fact, as in terms of research. I think it was it guinea pigs that you've raised generation after generation? Is that correct?
Hamsters, but hamsters. Sure, similar in a sense.
I was close. You've been involved with your company since 2015 in really looking at how to enable effective therapies to reach patients faster. And that's so critical. You've been harnessing digital technologies. You've been looking at clinical trial design. You're one of the founding members also of DTRA, DTRA.org. And I think that's a very important to note that many of you who are presenting today are founding leaders of this movement. Sharon Terry is with us. Sharon is going to be presenting a presentation as well. She's CEO of the Genetic Alliance. It's a very critical advocacy organization that brings together individuals, their families, other organizations seeking to transform health. Sharon is the CEO, as I mentioned, of the Genetic Alliance, which really is one of the organizations at the forefront of revolutionizing how we use and access information to improve individualized clinical decision-making. Stephanie Kuhner is really one of the key people on the practical element of decentralized clinical trials. She's on the board of DTRA. She's one of the founding board members of that group, DTRA.org. She is with the global leader Bristol Myers Squibb, where she serves as a global director of strategic sourcing and procurement, clinical technology, and patient recruitment at that global company. She has a background in clinical trial development, actually. And Steph, if I'm not mistaken, I think you also speak Chinese. Is that correct?
You have a great memory, Gil.
I try. I listen to people. Craig Lipset is with us today. Many of you saw Craig before COVID. He presented at Google Tel Aviv, a remarkable presentation. He has been in the forefront of innovation in clinical research and medicine development, first from his time at Columbia University, where he was really doing breakthrough work with one of the great neurology scientists, cardiology scientists, Dr. Ralph Sacco. He did breakthrough work with Ralph at Columbia. He moved to Pfizer, where he really was one of the founding leaders within Pfizer of clinical trial innovation. He was at the forefront before we were talking about remote clinical trials and decentralized trials. Craig was really in the trenches with the remote trial. I highly recommend, I think you published that paper, Craig, on remote. It's a great paper. It's a transparent paper. I recommend people look at that. Today, Craig is an advisor to technology and biopharmaceutical companies. He is teaching, I think, at Rutgers University and other universities. He's on the board of companies. He is working with the venture capital community. He's working with companies in Israel. He is also one of the co-founders of DTRA.org. And he's also, along with Dr. Amir Kalali, He is also the co-chair of DTRA. And it is a privilege also to introduce everybody to Dr. Emil Kalali. He's both a psychiatrist and a neurologist. He is truly one of the global leaders in clinical trial design and implementation. He was one of the key executives at global CRO leader Quintiles for many years. He really led up the biggest piece of their business, which is the neurology business. He is much more, though, to the drug development community. He is really our guide. He is a mentor to many of us. He lives at that intersection of life sciences and technology. He really was one of the early proponents of digital health technologies. He certainly understands the clinical design process. He is an advisor, an investor. He's a curator of communities. He's the driving force behind the CNS Summit, which I want to add will be meeting in person in November in Boston. I believe it's the week of November 15th, but he'll correct me if I'm wrong. And along with Craig Lipset, he is the co-founder of the DTRA community. Welcome to our extraordinary panelists. Thank you. We're going to start with a presentation. And to set us off, Craig is going to give us some background of what is this category we're talking about. Then we'll move to Michelle and Sharon. Craig, over to you.
Thank you so much, Gil. And it is such a pleasure to be back here with the mHealth Israel community. It has been 14 months since I last joined many of you in Tel Aviv, and what a 14 months it has been. Well, it's my pleasure to help to kick off our time together with a little bit of Decentralized Trial 101. So what I'm going to do is share just a little bit of content to help bring us all up to speed around what we're talking about with decentralized trials. And hopefully that will help us to all have a great conversation with the amazing panelists that Gil has brought together today. Every superhero story has to start with an origin story. And I think the decentralized trial origin story in many ways traces back to the work of Clayton Christensen and the innovators prescription dating back to around the 2009 timeframe. Clayton Christensen had described this phenomenon of centralization in healthcare, enabling the decentralization of health services. And what he was describing at the time was how we were seeing this shift of specialty services, imaging services, and so on, that were getting increasingly specialized and centralized. And in doing that, it enabling this ability for more remote care in the community, for more minute clinic-like models. It was really based on that I started some work back at Pfizer in the 2008-2009 timeframe that really took the same playbook of centralization, enabling new decentralized models. Because in clinical trials, we also had a lot of different services and capabilities centralized for many years. We centralized labs and EKGs. We centralized IRBs and ethics committees. The question then came up, could we centralize more of the role of the investigator? And if we could we, just as we were seeing elsewhere in healthcare, start to enable more distributed and decentralized capabilities? Now, this is an image that's taken from the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, CTTI, which is a public-private partnership with the FDA run out of Duke University. And there's a link there on the slide, which I know Lev has also shared on SlideShare, and the link is in the chat. Citi helped to roll up what I think are many of the benefits that we've recognized or been striving to realize with decentralized to date. And you'll see so much of this anchors around the participant. How can we enable faster enrollment into studies? How can we improve retention by improving access and convenience? How can we also bring a greater sense of control and engagement for participants? And how might decentralized approaches help us to overcome our barriers and constraints today around the lack of diversity and representation in our trials? Coming out of 2020, I think there's another potential benefit that we need to add to this list that I've put on the right side of the screen, which is around resilience and business continuity, because just as so many of the benefits have historically focused on supporting and improving the experience and access of individuals into our studies, what we're also seeing is coming out of this experience, the pandemic on a global basis, the importance of decentralized approaches providing an opportunity for clinical trials to continue in light of those circumstances. Now, I'm not going to go into this slide in great detail. I included it more for completeness. This is actually a slide I shared, I think, in Tel Aviv last February, prior to the pandemic, the 17-year history prior to COVID. I did not title it prior to COVID. I'm not that good of a prognosticator, but really meant to capture for folks the long history that has led to where we are today in the adoption of decentralized research, a space that really traces its way back to some early work at Boston University and in the early 2000s. And in this middle of the timeline, we see a lot of the effort that we were doing at Pfizer with that first fully remote, fully decentralized trial. But you can see the wave of activity that followed over the last 6 years leading into the pandemic, investments well over $100 million prior to COVID, major CROs announcing capabilities, experiments left and right. You would have thought, based on all of that activity on the right side of the slide, that most every pharma company was embracing and adopting decentralized research at scale. But in fact, in most cases, decentralized trials were an experiment or a one-off at best. And so that takes us into the last year. And I like to think about the trends that we've seen over the last year in adoption as following almost seasonal shifts, because it was roughly a year ago in the spring of 2020 that all eyes were focused on trial continuity. This was the time when lockdowns were first beginning, when patients were not necessarily able to leave their homes to get to a site or felt safe doing so, where clinical staff at many research sites needed to be redirected into places where there were shortages of healthcare providers. And so it was during this time that we started to see the early rapid adoption of decentralized research tools as a way to address this challenge of continuity. And in fact, from the data here, almost 80% of sponsors and CROs indicating on a global basis that there was this shift taking place, and 9 out of 10 research participants indicating that they were experiencing some sort of change in their participation. By the summer, we started to see some sponsors starting to look to resume studies that had been delayed with their starts. But again, a strong focus on this notion of hybrid, of including some elements of virtual and decentralized in their studies. And by the fall, we start to see these signals of commitment to these new approaches. And the data point I'm sharing here comes from actually the investigator site community, who answered to one survey on a global basis from WCG, the Global Ethics Committee, that while only maybe a quarter of sites used telemedicine prior to the pandemic, that number went up to close to 2/3 during the pandemic. But perhaps most important for this story, that almost 3/4 of sites indicating that they'll continue to use telemedicine and remote approaches in their trials after the pandemic. And that leads us to where we are today, as we've come out of the winter where people have really been eyes on scalability. How do we actually take these approaches that we've been rapidly introducing into our studies and make them sustainable and a part of our new normal for our business? And what are the challenges that we face when doing so? Most pharma companies, the large pharmas as well as many mid-sized today, are now starting to figure out what that scaled strategy looks like. And in many cases, it's something of a paired toolkit-like approach today, where more and more pharma are looking at what types of technologies and tools they need within their organization to enable this type of shift. And then how do we best pair those solutions with the different studies in our protocol, taking into account patient input and feedback, regulatory feedback on a global basis, and importantly, organizational culture. How far is my organization ready to go today? What's missing here right now today are more data-driven decision support tools, because we don't really have the data yet in order to enable that to happen. And so it is very much constrained by where people, how far are they willing to go? Now, as one of the final notes I'll call out here, scaled global adoption for life sciences companies does not come easy. There remains some ambiguity on a global basis around regulatory readiness and receptivity, including their ability to consistently make decisions based on data that's come in through different remote channels. That stands in the way for many pharma companies to embrace these approaches with consistency on a global basis. There are technology challenges in terms of data flow and interoperability. There are perceptions around the readiness of investigators and patients. Many of our endpoints, the things we measure for efficacy and safety, do not necessarily allow flexibility for patients to be able to enable those measurements from home, just as they would with the same confidence in the clinic. And perhaps most importantly, organizational culture continues to remain an important barrier for scaled adoption. Are our colleagues in pharma, CROs, sites, and regulators ready for those changes? I'm going to conclude with a couple of quick forecasts that I think hopefully will set up some good conversation. Going forward, we should expect to see more optionality for patients. How do decentralized approaches give patients more choice to go to the clinic when it makes sense for them, to stay home and participate remote when that's the best option for where they are in their journey? And we also should anticipate greater control for investigator sites to make use of some of their own technology. I think we'll start to see new doors open for treating physicians in the community who are not investigators in research to be able to engage because of these decentralized approaches. And then finally, how will decentralized pair together with some of the exciting opportunities around platform clinical trials that we're starting to see more of out there? I will stop over there, Gil, and gladly turn the baton over to my friend, Michelle.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you for that. That's a fantastic overview. And Michelle is going to provide us with a very in-depth view of this world from a practical standpoint. Michelle, over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let me go to screen share. Here we go. Okay. Okay, great. So I think that Craig really, teed it up well in terms of just this radical shift that we're seeing. And I think, as a physician and someone who has been treating patients for now, over 10 years, what I think is so exciting about this moment in time, but also helps us focus on where the challenges are, is if we look at the pace of preclinical development, it's astonishing almost in a sense with some of the technologies that we have. Prior to COVID, the mRNA technologies were being applied to cancer vaccines. And then we pivot to an entirely new application. And really within weeks, we're able to generate these new molecules, by synthetic and DNA technology and RNA technology. And this is just one platform. If we look at the platforms for preclinical development, really what I'm seeing is an ability to generate potential therapies, potential cures that is accelerating at such a pace. We saw this week or last week, the Recursion IPO. We're seeing just this massive acceleration of our ability to really create promising therapies. Now, prior to COVID, what we hadn't seen was an equal acceleration of the clinical development phase. And what that really means, if we just have new therapies, right, but we're unable to test them for safety and efficacy, we're not really able to meaningfully accelerate the ability to treat or cure disease. So, what makes me excited about our work at Medable and the decentralized clinical trial movement in general is, I truly believe that clinical development itself, the phase where we're no longer testing these things in a lab, we're now testing them in humans, is truly the existing bottleneck to curing diseases like cancer, like aging, if you call that a disease, like Alzheimer's. And I think that the work to be done, if we want to cure these diseases in the next 10 years, is going to largely be around accelerating clinical development, because this is the major bottleneck. As science on the preclinical side is just exploding. So our mission at Medable is really to provide, to be a critical player in the acceleration of clinical development. And this is that entire phase when we have a promising therapy and we need to test it and see if it's efficacious and safe in humans. Obviously, oops, hang on just a second. Let me stop my share because I didn't realize that I abandoned my presentation somehow. Give me 1 second. There we go. Sorry, guys. Am I sharing effectively? Sorry.
Not yet,
Not
Michelle.
yet.
I know that you're used to you're skilled in going on with the narrative.
The show.
Going on with
Okay.
the show. I just want
Okay,
to say
cool.
this earlier. Michelle just finished raising $78 million for a venture. These technical snafus are nothing for her.
Yeah. Okay. Am I screen sharing now? Okay, but not, oh, sorry, hang on. Sorry. Just a second. Not now. Yeah. Okay, great. Okay, perfect. How weird. I'm getting a Zoom bug. Sorry. That's so odd.
Okay, why don't you continue with your narrative?
Okay,
For
cool.
a bit, then we'll go over to Sharon.
That's totally fine.
By the way,
so-
I just want to mention, Michelle, your presentation is actually in SlideShare form on the M Health Meetup site. So for
Okay,
people who want to
perfect.
access this presentation, just go to the site, and Levy will also put it into the chat.
Okay, great. So what's really
So
exciting.
Do you see on the screen your presentation that I just shared? Do you see that?
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. That's
Okay.
perfect. Okay. So what's been so exciting is we, really look at, how the world has shifted. Is I don't think that in the conservative and very highly regulated world of life sciences, we have really seen an adoption of clinical technologies like we have in the last year. So in the last year, this concept of decentralized, as Craig hit on, really went from an edge case to a main case. And if you forward one slide, the reason was that sites all over the world were actually unable to provide access to patients. So it was a really interesting part of the entrepreneurial journey, was when we had anticipated patients being remote. And, our entire infrastructure was set up for patients to be at home and being able to participate in clinical trials. And then the pandemic hit and we started receiving, phone calls from our site partners and our sponsor partners. And something we hadn't taken into consideration was the doctors were also at home. The entire clinical staff was at home. So quickly we really adapted our technology to be deployed anywhere to enable even the physicians and clinical site staff to conduct clinical trials from home. And we just saw this very rapid adoption of some of the, kind of lighter weight decentralized technologies like telemedicine. Then over time, we started to see greater adoption of wearables and sensors to get the vital signs. And, now fast forward slightly over a year, we have seen adoption of, and if you go forward, these methodologies into many therapeutic areas, and really now looking not to layer in technology to clinical trials that were in flight, but to really start from the beginning, planning clinical trials that are leveraging these technologies and decentralization from the beginning. And to me, what this says is we're really shifting. We're shifting from a clinic-based approach to a patient-based approach. And the analogy I make is, it's people wonder, are we going back? And I look at things like Sears Roebuck versus Amazon. There are videos you can find on YouTube of Wall Street analysts saying, how is the Amazon stock worth more than Sears Roebuck? And Sears Roebuck will surely put Amazon out at some point. But the reality was Sears Roebuck wasn't the trend that was competing with Amazon, right? Amazon was riding an entirely different wave. And the opportunity set for Amazon was really defined largely by the value it could create and by its own ability to execute in this new world with new technologies, bringing these things directly into people's lives. And Sears was just never actually, everything had shifted. And I think that's really where we are today. I think that the new horizon is really not about going back. It's about what we define and how far we push and how fast to enable participation in research really anytime, anywhere, in a kind of on-demand, patient-centered, consumer-focused, not the go to the restaurant, but the DoorDash, Uber Eats model. And we're seeing that this is a large trend from a macro perspective, really across different industries of technology and really consumer behavior. So if you forward one slide, why I think this is so exciting is that it is really an avenue for us to solve that bigger problem, which is how do we accelerate clinical development? How, as we have so many new therapies, we take the clinical phase and condense it like we did from 12 years to 1 year? How can we bring that warp speed approach to largely every therapy that we're developing that has promise? And what's exciting is when we shift from a clinic to a consumer or a person, now we are solving for some of the biggest pain points. In the 12-year timeline of clinical development, 40% of that time is enrollment in many cases. So the ability to connect a person to a trial is a huge utilizer of that time and something that really is a driver that we need to tackle if we're going to accelerate development. So by providing ubiquitous access and partnering with patients throughout the entire journey from, ideally having populations who are ready for trials, and we'll talk about this in a second, where we have data on participants, and then we can actually enable personalized matching in real time to those people, facilitate a broader set of data to be captured, enroll in trials, and really see research as a part of our healthcare journey. This is what I think we're opening the door to. So how, and we can go forward a couple of slides. Yeah, perfect. How we really do this at Medable, and just a quick, look at our technology stack, is we take these clinical protocols, which are very scientific, and we translate them into a digital solution that is partnering with a patient. And we do this in over 60 countries and in 60 languages. And these are technologies that patients use on their own phones, in their own homes, in their own neighborhoods, in their own communities, that really enable people to participate all over the world versus the limited number of clinical sites that would otherwise be eligible, because they're able to connect with these experts remotely. If we go forward 2 slides, perfect. We can skip this one. And so what does this look like? It looks like a kind of fit for purpose digital technology that is helping connect a patient, understand if they're a fit for a clinical trial, enable them to enroll in a clinical trial, and do all of the activities of that clinical trial. And so, this is where I would say we are today. Now, some of the barriers are there are endpoints or measures that are not designed to be captured remotely. So the work we're doing with with organizations like DTRA, which Craig and Amir lead, really help us start to tackle what are the real barriers to doing this across every therapeutic area and in every protocol. And so DTRA is helping us tackle some of those challenges to make this real across the entire development lifecycle. If we go forward, what I think where the new horizon is to say, okay, if we think about development of clinical trials as one moment in time, there is a much broader set of data that we could capture, something we call the digitome, which is really a 360 representation of all of our health. So let's say today that we could connect with a technology ecosystem that just was initiating a secure and generation of data that would help us understand our health and when we're a fit for a clinical trial. Then we could, if you go forward 1 slide, really seamlessly enroll in a clinical trial at the right time. And I think that, when I look at what Israel was able to do in the COVID vaccine space, this is a perfect ecosystem to facilitate a proactive clinical development, clinical research world. You've got a community of people who are highly informed and technology engaged, clearly excited, I think, about clinical development. And I believe that with the right technology infrastructure, we could enable a lightweight kind of ecosystem to capture data and enable people to be matched to clinical research and bring that into their daily lives and really begin to tackle this 40% enrollment and matching timeline to reduce development of all drugs, by at least 40%. So that's this concept of the digitome, where we're really able to have a proactive data set and match people in real time to clinical research opportunities versus having a clinical research opportunity and then going and finding that needle in a haystack, so to speak. So why this matters, and this will be my last slide, is when you look at that area in yellow, the clinical trial is a very small point in time for the entire life story of all of us. If we even, if we were to participate in clinical trials, there's this, for every participant, there's a massive amount of data surrounding the clinical trial. The years before that even led to the diagnosis, that time frame where someone's been diagnosed and now they may be initially treated, that point in time where they're actually in a clinical trial, but then the entire point in time afterward, where they're receiving healthcare in parallel to those therapies or on to the next part of their lives. So I think we need to begin thinking, as we think about decentralized, a much bigger story, a much bigger opportunity to reduce clinical development radically. And to me, what that is a world where healthcare, which is oriented around outcomes, and clinical development, which is oriented around research, are really part of the same fabric, where all of us, I believe, should be participating in research, and that research should yield better outcomes, and outcomes should also be driven by research. So that's kind of the thinking. And thank you guys so much.
No, Michelle, that was fantastic, and really provides a, if Craig provided us with a 30,000-foot view, you were kind enough to provide us with a 3,000-foot view, and they connect. Now we're going to shift over to Sharon Terry. As I mentioned, Sharon is the CEO of Genetic Alliance, and we're going to deal with the reality of it all. It's all about patients. Ultimately, this is not a theoretical conversation. It is about people's lives. So Sharon, thank you so much for joining us from the West Coast today. And let you begin with your presentation, and then we'll go into a panel conversation.
Great, thanks very much. Very happy to be here. Really thrilled to be with the health community and also with my colleagues here on this call. I'll make my presentation fairly fast so we can get to the meat of a discussion, which I think is really important. I love the saying that the best time was 20 years ago, the second best time is now. And what I've done from a patient point of view has purely come from a patient point of view in the sense that my children were diagnosed in 1994 with a skin disease, eye disease called PXE, pseudoxanthoma elasticum. And this slide is just to say that we had to, before the internet was really in common use, do the kinds of things we've been talking about already today. And I met Craig early on in my journey, and I'm happy to contribute to DTRA as well. I took what I had done here, which was essentially to establish registries and biobanks and various things along the clinical development and trials pathway all those years ago, brought them to Genetic Alliance, where I'm now CEO, and have built a whole bunch of tools that have been really critical, I think, for a lot of the patient community. More than 2,000 patient advocacy organizations are under our umbrella. This is where the community part hits, the rubber hits the road. And I'm only going to talk about one tool, but more about the philosophy, the big picture of the promise for engaging everyone responsibly, which is at the top of the slide. What we find in this dawn of age of people-driven research is at first a lot of lip service, I believe. And so in the mid 2000s, I began to put together some of the arguments that I thought we needed to make so that we could get to patient centricity in a true way, that in fact, we should be driving the research. We should be the ones who are recruiting the investigators. And we've assembled now hundreds and even thousands of communities who are doing that, building on the backs of what we had done years ago. There are some essential elements, and I won't go through all these, but we learned early on that we should not be saying, you should trust us. It's part of the issue around diversity in clinical trials, that we expect that we can helicopter into communities and that we can in fact engage them. Instead, we should be asking, how are we trustworthy, and putting that burden on ourselves. From N of 1 to common conditions and everything in between, I think we really need to look at what we can understand from different kinds of science, like community-based participatory research, computational social choice research. We worked with the PCORnet groups for 5 years. We were trained by Obama's campaign team to do this kind of on the ground, both high tech and high touch engagement throughout the process. This is an example of one of the communities that we have on our platform, this peer promise for engaging everyone responsibly, essentially allowing the community itself to come forward. And it's a good example of the problem of trials being in one location. Early on, this is public, that we partnered with Biogen to do this project in KCNT1 epilepsy. The initial trials that they were considering, and actually the academics were driving, required that these children with this epilepsy that involves 100 seizures a day, that these kids would go to a center in the US that was moderately remote, but that you'd put a child on an airplane, this was pre-COVID, just before COVID, and it asked them to be out of their own environment, to be in a situation where they might even exacerbate their condition. And so we challenged that with Biogen, and thankfully the leadership there rose to the occasion and allowed that we organize this community, which didn't really exist. It was a Facebook community, that we in fact do the trials in people's homes so the children could stay where they were. And I think more importantly, even that we could develop new endpoints. The endpoints were the number of seizures per day, and what we heard from the parents using the technologies that we've created, this computational social choice system, that in fact, eye contact and grasping and sitting up and drooling were more important than the seizures. And in fact, even we're able to ferret out some treatments because of our work with these parents. I'm going to skip the video here. So on this platform, we partner with Luna DNA, which is owned by the people. So this is a company that the SEC has granted the concept that shares in the company, all the shares are owned by the people who share their data. And so contributing data, either DNA data, electronic health record integration with 700,000 portals in the US and beyond, surveys that are validated instruments, as well as PRO that we're creating on the fly and validating. And then the studies that are being done on the platform all allow individuals to receive shares in the company Luna DNA, which is overseen by a public benefit corporation, Luna PBC. They are our technology partner and our philosophic and principal partner as well. And what we're finding is that people are really excited to be able to be involved in every way, including dividends and shares in what's happening. This is really important because in this instance, this allows people to keep a string on their data and know what is happening to that data, because all of this is done within the platform. Again, a dashboard where you can see how many shares you've earned and what studies might be upcoming for you. We have a COVID study, we have women's health studies, veteran studies, and then lots and lots of communities doing specific work around a particular disease. We also do this in several languages, and as we work more and more in this regard, we realize, of course, that this idea that we come to communities where they live, work, eat, play, and pray is really critical, and so being able to do this in their community is important. This is a schematic of how this works in a very rudimentary way, essentially that the person is allowing or contributing data, in this case, the KCNT1 community, in a bigger genetic epilepsy and children's study, partnering with various companies like Invitae or Biogen. And then the workbench that we have attached to the platform has many tools in it, and investigators can bring their own tools as well. I like to say we want to have not only people at the center at this end, but also at this end, and that we allow that, in fact, individuals, smart Girl Scouts might be doing the research instead of having traditional investigators. So my last slide. In our work to put clinical trials in the home, we like to say that we are actually starting in the home. We're not actually bringing the trial to them, but in fact coming from the community, that all individuals across all diagnoses and phenotypes are in one system. In our case, that these participants respond to basic surveys, that the study protocol is actually changed and created by the participants themselves. The investigators can analyze the data for inclusion/exclusion criteria. We have an anonymous recontact tool so that the longitudinality and the recontact is easy. Participants consent to do these studies. The platform's used to schedule the visits and so on. Investigators analyze the trial data and prepare it for regulatory submission. And results are also returned through the platform to the individuals, again, feeling that the people need to be in the cycle all the way through. We have seen that the companies are very interested in this. We've had a harder time with the academics and the CROs, but I do also see that shifting in the same way that the two presenters before me spoke about. Thanks very much.
Sharon, that was magnificent. I want to thank you very much. I think that the presentations from Craig and Michelle and yourself really create a very unique suite of conversation. I would urge all of our participants to download your presentations, study them closely, and return to the three of you with additional questions. I want to jump into our panel conversation right now. I'm going to start with Dr. Kalali and Steph Kuhner from Bristol Myers Squibb. I'm going to pivot, Sharon, from some of the comments that you just made and ask them a key question. Dr. Kalali, I'm going to start with you first, and Steph, I'm going to ask you to think about this question, because you're really in the leadership of translating the vision of decentralized trials into the practical aspect of mobilizing people to it. So Dr. Kalali, you really have been thinking about this concept for quite some time. You have been a pioneer in the sector. You're one of the early innovators of combining both the standard of trial design along with technology. As you say, you're at the intersection of those two aspects. So my question for you is, it's pretty evident that decentralized trials bring a benefit, as Sharon mentioned, to the patient community. That's somewhat evident, clear. But it's also clear that this is not an easy path. It's going to have challenge to it. There is going to require implementing new protocols. It's going to require using new technologies. Could you provide us with your kind of overview, your vision of where we're going and what will be a better place when we all unite? And I just want to add to our audience that Dr. Kalali and Craig and others who are part of all the people participating today are founding members of DTRA.org. I recommend you go to the website. You might be interested in joining the organization. Some 100 companies, major companies like Bristol Myers Squibb, are founding members. So back to you, Dr. Kalali. Could you provide your insight of, it's evident, what's the challenge?
Sure, absolutely. And thank you very much to both Levi and Gil for putting together really such a great panel. I really thought that those three talks really address, with Craig giving it a sort of overview, with really Michelle talking about kind of what the innovators are doing, and really Sharon probably what most of us feel most strongly about, which is how do we as an enterprise within clinical development are truly patient-centric, and I don't even like using that word, it's so overused, but what Sharon said, not purely sort of lip service. So I think in terms of kind of what we can do, I have a lot of trust in the fact that many people in the life sciences got into it to help others, right? And I think part of that is really trying to create that culture where people can actually understand that there's certain things they can compete on from a commercial basis, but there are other things that very much have to be pre-competitive and help everyone. And that's one of the things we're trying to obviously create with the DTRA community, which is how there are definitely areas that would benefit all, and we're working very hard on initiatives to do that. So what I'm hopeful about is the fact that the enormous sort of feedback we've had from people who truly understand that and are working together from all sectors within DTRA. And what was really interesting to me is when we looked at our priorities, when we asked the membership what those should be, it was not clear to me that with such a diverse range of categories that we would, whether it's government, pharma, patient groups, sites, that we would come to consensus. But actually what has been really pleasantly surprising to me was how much the areas that we looked at were in common and people really were in agreement of what the priorities should be. So that's why I would say that I'm very hopeful that that we would really leverage that sense of community and collaboration to really push forward for these changes.
Thank you, Amir. And I think that that's really the spirit, and everything that you and our panelists do is the spirit of collaboration. Steph, I want to shift over to you. You're really, you're at ground zero of making this happen. You have been one of the earliest proponents of decentralized clinical trials. You're a champion at Bristol Myers Squibb. I mean, you're rallying an entire community to this endeavor. I mean, your company is clearly hyper-focused on the patient. And so you're looking at this through the lens of how do you make trials more inclusive and really address people's needs. Can you reflect on these presentations and sort of say, gee, operationally, it is evident. Here's kind of our thinking process to embrace the vision.
Yes, absolutely. And I thought, to Amir's point earlier, the presentations did a great job of setting the stage. And of course, in my mind, all I could think about is why can't we move faster? I think as we really think about being on the ground, readiness and resistance are two things that really truly come to mind. And I know Craig talked about this, but DCTs have been around for a while. They're not new. While the idea of wider adoption is new, I think having that plan and strategy in place to really, and I don't want to use the word challenge, but to create that collaboration within your own environment to saying yes, I think is really, really important and critical. Historically speaking, many of my colleagues and other colleagues across the industry have been trained around, this is the way we execute clinical trials and this is the norm. And so creating an environment where there's not repercussions around deviations and trying something, and maybe we have to pivot, or I don't like to use the word failure, but should we learn something from an experience, being okay with that, I think it's going to help us really push the envelope a bit further. I mean, the future is now, right? And so how can we just really penetrate more widely across the industry is really where I'm focusing and thinking about where we can go from here. And a lot of that does start with patient engagement too. So, and it's not even patient engagement, it's sponsor engagement, it's site engagement, it's engagement across the index. And so having that right level of buy-in and engagement and support and level of, the champions that are here with us is going to be a big component to the success of where we go from here.
Great. It's great listening to you. Both you and Amir touched on something that, I just want to bring back to our audience, that it may not be the lack of ideas or invention that's at our fingertips, but I think you and Amir have pointed to our behavior as the sort of the ultimate challenge. It's fascinating for those who meet you at Summit or through DTR. Both of you know that you're highly collaborative people, and so I think what you've both touched on is mindset and collaborative behavior is the challenge here, not ideas or innovation. I want to spring over now to Michelle, because Michelle, you're also one of the founding members of DTRA. I want to ask you and Craig sort of like a part one part two question of the same big question here. Michelle, you're working with companies, you're helping them really look into the future. Obviously, you have all these technologies at your fingertips. What technologies do you find are most important when you're in the room talking to prospective clients, for instance? What technologies do you really have to master from an information standpoint, from a digital health standpoint? And Craig, you've been involved in remote trials since the get-go. You designed one of the first trials. I think maybe it was Viagra. I don't remember exactly, or another drug. But you've been looking at this from the very, very, very beginning. I'd be curious to have you compare, after Michelle answers, knowing what you know now, what you do now, knowing what you know now, what you might have done then, sort of like to Sharon's point, the then and the now. So Michelle, over to you. What
Sure.
are some of the technologies when you're in the room that clients say, yes, absolutely, we need that?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, I think that what we see is you've got kind of two worlds. You've got the experts on the sponsor side in clinical development, and then you have experts in technology, like Medable. I think, what sponsors are looking for is really a Sherpa of us, in a sense, who can map the technology to the science and say, in psoriasis, in breast cancer, in, ulcerative colitis, here are the things that work for patients, and here are the things that work for sites, and here's how we're going to capture the data on safety and efficacy. And I think, honestly, Gil, like in every scenario, that may be a slightly different combination, but what our partners are looking for is an informed and expert perspective on what works, and then also transparency around, to Steph's point, what hasn't yet been proven, but for these reasons would be a sound approach. So, I think it's very much mapping that technology to the science of that given clinical trial, answering the questions on safety and efficacy, and then looking at where technology can remove key barriers and leveraging existing experience in those categories.
Thank you very much. Craig, reflecting on Michelle's answer and what you've heard right now, your expertise, you've been involved in not only designing trials, but implementing them. You can reflect to what worked, what didn't work. What do you think, knowing what you know now, can you sort of like in a snapshot say, hey, this is the recipe?
Michelle, Michelle gave my answer, but it was buried inside of a little bit, and I want to pull it out a bit. When we did that first remote trial, we enthusiastically led with technology to try to solve everything, and took an approach that we wanted to engage patients entirely online and have them participate in the research entirely from home. In the 10 years since doing that study, I've literally spoken with hundreds of patients about their preferences and wishes when it comes to remote trial participation and access. And the message is very clear that people don't want to be left on their own. There's a shared decision-making element that we left behind when we did that first remote study. We left behind the fact that an interventional clinical trial of a new medicine is typically recruiting people that already have a diagnosis and are already on an existing therapy. And so they have a doctor in their life. And so the opportunity for us to use technology to solve challenges around access, rather than try to force technology as a solution for everything, making sure that we're stopping and talking to and listening to patients throughout that process, so that we're using technology in a way that actually solves their challenges. Just a bit of trivia. Patients, when surveyed about their experience in clinical trials today, rate their participation extremely high. When you look at data from CISCRP, the Center for Information on the Study of Clinical Research Participation, almost 9 out of 10 patients will say that they're receiving the same or better care than they would have had they not been in a trial. the challenge is not that patients don't like investigators in research studies or don't feel well cared for. The challenge is they can't access them. And so we have to make sure, to Michelle's point, that we're using technology in ways that actually solves the challenge at hand. So I think if I were to go back to myself of a decade ago, I'd probably be nudging myself to, be excited about the technology, but stop and talk to patients more.
So I'm going to pivot off of that, Craig. I'm going to steal one of your quotes that you often say. We talk about inviting patients to the table. This is, everybody, mark this down. Craig Lipset said it first.
No. Actually, whenever I say it, I attribute it to Sharon Terry, who's actually—
That's exactly where I'm going to.
Us.
So thank you. So I'm going to pivot over to Sharon, stealing your quote and your sentiment. It's not our table, it's their table. They're inviting us to their table. They have the urgency, they have the need. We wouldn't exist as an industry if, sadly, people were not ill. So Sharon,
I have to say, Gil, I had Sharon come to one of my last companies, this big pharma. She came down to Florida to this executive meeting with, hundreds of our leaders in R&D and development. And the question she raised there, who said it was your table in the first place, right? You're excited to invite us to your table, but who made it your table? So Sharon, I'm so excited to get to throw this back at you.
Yeah. So Sharon, you've heard from all these people. We're talking about technology. We're talking about information. We're talking about trial design. Hey, guess what, everybody? It's about people who have real serious health concerns. They want answers. What's your perspective about what we've been talking about?
So I'm loving what we're talking about, and I'm very aware that we really need to be in the communities that we're talking about, whether they're affinity groups or they're, large across the globe communities of individuals with diseases. Yeah, I like to say if we're not at the table, we're on the menu, which some of you have heard, and that we really do need to be constructing this from the ground up, which is why I'm real interested in how do we bring communities together even before companies are interested in a therapy, to allow them to say, what's important to me? Yes, we have to get regulatory approved endpoints, et cetera. But I think we can do that in partnership with people where they live, where they are gathering, in social media, in physical communities, as well as in virtual ones.
Thank you, Sharon, for that, and Craig for the setup. So we have a few moments left. I want to ask sort of an important round robin question. I'm going to change the question a little bit for Dr. Kalali. I hope he doesn't mind. The question I want to ask all of you, and I want you to think about, I love putting Amir on the spot lovingly, because he's really, he's our go-to guru when it comes to all these topics. And he's the igniter. He's one of the connectors of the community. So I want to ask all of you, what's keeping you up at night in terms of making decentralized trials the sort of the standard of how we engage people? Amir, Dr. Kalali, you embody the spirit of collaboration, of connectivity. What we talk about superpowers. Your superpower is bringing people together. So in the context of what keeps you up at night, I just want to address it to something that you master. You have a superpower. You're able to unite people, whether it's the FDA, whether it's big pharma, whether it's patient groups, whether it's innovators, somehow or another, you're able to bring people to the table. Steph talked about that as a major challenge within, whether it's organizations themselves or within bigger communities. What's your formula for saving us and making this conversation we've heard today a reality?
Well, first of all, I think it's patients that will save us, not us. But in terms of what keeps me up during the day, let's say, right, as you mentioned, I sleep quite well, is what I think about, during the day is really the culture and the complacency and how, look, most people in life science are scientists. We've been taught very well how to say no, how to find, all the problems that could be. So it's just a very cultural thing that scientists, that's what we've been trained. We're kind of the opposite of stand-up, right? Instead of everything being yes, everything is no, and everything, and to be fair, compared to tech, there are patients' lives involved. So the conservatism, there's some reason for that, right? So we can't, go overboard and say we can just change everything overnight and not worry about the consequences. So I think it's that balance between the conservatism, which is sometimes appropriate, and really the technology and other factors that can get us there. So I think it's just trying to get people to get comfortable with being uncomfortable and to really listen to patients, like Craig and Sharon have said.
Thank you very much, Amir, for that. That's wise counsel for everybody listening in. Steph, you really have been a model in terms of bringing people together in collaboration. Bristol Myers Squibb really has really leaned into the whole concept of decentralized clinical trials. You being one of the leaders there who's advocating for greater participation. But still, I know that you take this very seriously. You care about patients. You've been involved in clinical trial design. When you look at this and you look at the sense of the personal responsibility you hold as an advocate for patients within this company, what's keeping you up at night?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And, my role specific here at BMS is highly focused on business partnering and strategy. And so I think about the increase, especially since COVID has occurred, of players in this space, and whether they're a complete DCT company or they touch one component of a remote monitoring service as part of the overall model. But the one thing that keeps me up is trying to understand the risk, and that making sure that our partners that we select to work with have the right protections in place so that we're not putting the business at risk. And the first thing that comes to mind certainly is the increase in cyber events that are occurring, not only within our industry, but outside of it, and making sure that we will be able to continue in a business continuity, I should say, will still continue, and that we won't need to shut everything down as we become more widely acceptable of the different approaches or strategies in the clinical trial space.
That's the reality of it. Thank you so much, Steph. Michelle, you listen to what Steph just said, and you're on that other side of the table. You're the partner. They're the driver of innovation. You're the partner. What's keeping you up at night as the partner?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately I frame it from the lens of a physician treating patients who have uncured or suboptimally treated diseases. And I just can't emphasize enough. I think what keeps me up at night is, are we being aggressive enough in accelerating clinical development? Because I just think it's one of the most important things we can do right now. And I think when we approach it aggressively, we're going to impact patient lives in a really positive way. As we saw with COVID, I mean, I'm vaccinated. I've traveled again, traveling to see my partners, and like my life is resuming because of these therapies. So I don't know, that's what keeps me up at night. How do we do this better? How do we do it faster for patients?
Wow. I've got to go over to Sharon right now with that question, because I think it's almost like you're connected to each other. Sharon talked about a community that, time is precious, time matters. Sharon, I know a lot keeps you up day and night because you're an advocate for countless people. But specifically, if you could highlight in terms of decentralized clinical trials, what is keeping you up at night?
I think the biggest thing for me, and thanks, Michelle, because I really just want to build on that, is that this is the choir right here. We're all preaching to the choir, and that we convincing other parts of the industry that we actually can do what we're talking about here quite safely and quickly and less expensive and more engaged, and getting the evidence and proof we need to convince the whole ecosystem that this is the way to go. Keeps me up at night. I'm amazed that as an industry, we're okay with high failure rates and very, very high costs. And then we come to things like, let's do this in someone's home, and the pushback is, but that's risky. So I think reassessing risk, doing some change management about leadership and thinking will help us move this needle forward.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you so much. So, Craig, you are known for the pointed response, and I'm going to turn to you to wrap up this round as we conclude and ask you, I know that you think about this all the time. You're advising companies all around the world. You're on speaker platforms, conference calls with clients that you're advising. But at the reality, what is keeping you up at night?
The reality is, as I build on what Sharon just mentioned, change agents and innovators in our industry have to be opportunists. They know that the wind for change around decentralized is with us right now, and it will not be here forever. They need to rush. They know that. They need to be able to embed commitments in their organization with some instance of a decentralized strategy with urgency. It might not be perfect. There will be opportunities for a version 1.1 and a version 1.2, but they know that if they don't get version 1.0 up in their organization while the momentum is with them, then that window will be lost. And so that's where my head is, right now, is how do I help all of those leaders in industry that are trying to make that commitment stick so that they can continue to improve upward. It doesn't have to be perfect, but we have to get these commitments in place now.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. I want to thank you, Craig, for your participation and comments. Sharon, Terry, thank you so much. Incredible comments. Dr. Michelle Longmire, thank you so much for this. And again, congratulations on the funding round. It's great. Stephanie Kuhner and Bristol Myers Squibb, thank you for your leadership and your participation. Dr. Emil Kalali, thank you so much for your leadership throughout our community. I'm personally looking forward to seeing you face-to-face soon in November at CNS Summit. It will be a great meeting. I highly recommend it to everybody. Last, to Levi Shapiro and the mHealth Israel community, you are leaders in this world. You are learning, you are adapting, you are tapping into some of the global experts, the 5 people we've hosted today. You are leaders of innovation that will improve the human condition. Thank you all so much for joining this session. Levi, back to you.
So on behalf of the whole community, shalom. That means hello, because we look forward to seeing you here post-pandemic. Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Evie.
Thank you.